So what I'm going to address today, I was telling you, is a key problem in motor control. How the central nervous system controls the movement of the body. From daily living actions to complex, sophisticated skills, control of movement requires coordinating many muscles and mastering the complex dynamics of a multi-articulated systems. Now, decades of investigations in neuroanatomical, neurophysiological, behavioral, bioengineering investigations have provided a comprehensive knowledge of the neural mechanism and the control strategies. Indeed, Raјka Tomovиќа himself, the problem of muscle coordination was one of his many interests. However, I believe a full understanding of the functional organization of motor control is still missing. So today, I will try to convince you that a simple yet quantitative model of the generation of muscle patterns, that is the combination of muscle synergies, may be useful to make real progress in understanding motor control. I will present a couple of examples of how identifying muscle synergies from the muscle pattern recorded during a task provides insights in the neural control. And I will also show how virtual reality and myoelectric control can be used to test the prediction of how muscle synergies affect motor learning, and also how the inter-individual differences in motor learning may emerge in terms of learning abilities. And finally, I will, if time permits, if I can go over, I will also briefly discuss how this new perspective on neural control movement may impact neurorehabilitation. So, if these, okay. So, we can really realize how complex and challenging is the control of the human body if we try to control a humanoid robot. This is illustrated, this is a few years ago in 2015, there were the finals of the DARPA Robotic Challenge. So state-of-the-art humanoid robots fail in tasks that are very sort of routinely done by humans. In essence, what is challenging in controlling the human body is the fact that there are many degrees of freedom. This makes the dynamics and kinematics very complex. Not only, but the actuators, the biological actuators are redundant, and they have non-linearities. Muscles are only non-negative. And not only, but the same controller has to be used in a variety of tasks. There has to be large versatility of the system. So let's briefly consider even a simple movement like reaching for a cup. This entails rather sophisticated, complex solving computational problem, which is complex. Indeed, traditionally, we can look at the problem of control as that of implementing a sensorimotor transformation that is mapping sensory information, vision and perception, where is the target, where is my limb, into motor command, that is implementing a control policy. And now the question then is, how is this implemented by the neural circuitry? And in particular, what is the functional organization of this transformation? So what is in this box is really the open question we're trying to address. Now, we know that the nervous system is a very large recurrent neural network made of spiky neurons, and here just depicted in this cartoon by a feed-forward network. And we also know that any neural network can be trained to learn arbitrary mapping and arbitrary computation. However, to learn a mapping when you have billions, a huge number of synaptic weights that you have to adjust, typically requires a very large number of training trials, so trials and errors. And this contrasts with the observation of fast and efficient skill learning, or even the fact that we have innate motor skills that at birth can be seen. So such a sort of neural network might implement for each of one infinite potentially different goals, imagine reaching in different directions. This network might learn a mapping, but then this approach has a problem with the memory capacity. You have to store a mapping for each possible goal. Alternatively, you can think that this network is able to compute on the fly, essentially maybe in an optimal manner, the right control signals, But this is what the engineers would do, but this requires a lot of knowledge of the system, of the musculoskeletal system and the task to be performed. It is not clear how the nervous system may acquire this knowledge from a limited number of examples. Then maybe one possible solution is illustrated by a real simple toy model. Imagine you have to actuate a vehicle in this case, and you have 4 degrees of freedom, 4 wheels. It is clear that you don't need to control them all independently. In fact, you can remove some degrees of freedom, you can lock them, and you can coordinate the others. Now, there is a long-standing hypothesis in neurophysiology, starting from Sherrington and Bernstein, that maybe this is the same solution that the central nervous system uses. That is, in order to control, coordinate the muscles for any movement, you may simply group muscular degrees of freedom, group of muscles, as functional units, and then coordinates and control just group of them, here represented by different colors. Now then, these sort of large neural network may actually become, through a modular architecture, a simpler system to learn and to execute as a controller, because essentially you can group various degrees of freedom, and particularly in the output and the muscle activation, as control units. And these units essentially may simplify the implementation because they contain information that is shared across different tasks, different movement, different conditions. So they become essentially low-dimensional basis function to construct a potentially large set of solutions, each involving a large number of degrees of freedom. So this idea essentially can be formulated in a relatively simple but quantitative hypothesis that is a controller that is based on muscle synergies may essentially simplify the generation of motor commands because it groups control signals into units, into what we can call muscle synergies. And this is, where is the simplification? The fact that you need to select a much smaller number of control parameters to execute a movement with respect to the full set of degrees of freedom. And also this is only possible if these synergies are properly organized. That is, they capture what needs to be shared across different conditions, the regularities of the motor commands across different conditions. Now, this approach, essentially, the notion itself of muscle synergy has a long history in neurology, in neurophysiology. And what I will focus today on is on a notion that is based on, again, a simple but quantitative model that was introduced in the laboratory of Emilio Bizzi at MIT about 20 years ago, and the laboratory where I did my PhD. And essentially is based on the definition that muscle synergy is nothing else than a coordinated recruitment of a group of muscles with specific balances of activation of the muscles or specific waveforms. And of course, this, what is invariant, what is specific in the organization can be defined in the spatial, in the temporal, or in the spatio-temporal domains. But what is key, what is essential, is that synergies can be flexibly combined to generate motor commands. That is, they act as basis function. They can be combined in different ways. Let me illustrate this concept with a simple example of in the case of a spatial synergies, meaning across the different muscular degrees of freedom. Imagine you have 5 muscles, very simple system. Each synergy here is a column, a different color, represent a particular balance of activation of a group of muscles. So then you can essentially modulate the activity of one synergy by some sort of recruitment intensity coefficient, and then all the muscle will scale proportionally. But importantly, you can mix different amounts of different synergies. In this way, you will get much larger flexibility. And indeed, if the time-varying mixing coefficient varies over time, you can generate a variety of graded muscle patterns that can be underlying the control of a variety of movements. Now, the same sort of combinatorial mechanism can be applied to temporal synergies, where the synergy is defined as activation waveform in time, or combination of the two in the spatio-temporal domain. Now, so far I introduced just a generative model. Now, how could I conceive the generation of motor commands? But how can we identify synergies from the data and provide evidence? Again, let me resort to a simple conceptual model to illustrate the point. Imagine that you have a system with 3 muscles, just because 3 you can easily represent as a point in space. So if you see a particular movement, a particular condition of a task, you can represent the activity of this group of muscles as a point in this space. Now imagine that you observe that across different conditions, what you see is that all these points are aligned. it means they are in a one-dimensional manifold, then I believe you will agree with me that it's reasonable to infer that there is a sort of coordination, there is a single unit that generates, that activates, recruits these muscles with a particular balance. In a similar way, but extending this concept, imagine that now that you observe not a single linear sort of regularity, but all observations lay on a plane, in this case of a three-dimensional space, or more generally in a subspace or in a hyperplane of a higher dimensional muscle activation space. In this two-dimensional case, it will be reasonable to infer also there are just two components that are mixed to generate all this. So not all possible activation, observe only those generated by this combination of units. Now, this approach essentially has been used starting from 20 years ago in the laboratory of Emilio Bizzi, and then in many more groups, in a growing sort of interest in this approach, exactly by using dimensionality reduction algorithms, principal component analysis, non-negative matrix factorization. The details are not important here, but essentially we can identify the nature of this plane in muscle activation space. And this has been applied in a number of systems, starting with the frog, where Master Synergies have been identifying the withdrawal reflex of the frog. My work for the PhD will look at more complex natural behavior again on the frog, on the humans, in locomotion, in postural control. And when I move to Rome, for example, look at the muscle patterns, spatial temporal synergies for reaching movements. Now, I want to, just to illustrate today, for a matter also of time, a couple of examples of how this decomposition approach can lead to some insight of the strategies that the central nervous system uses to control. Let's take a simple example of generating force in different directions. We have a virtual reality system where subjects have a hand resplint and can apply forces, and they see the feedback of a force applied as displacement of a cursor, essentially an elastic system. And we can record the EMG and forces. And simply by looking at the EMGs and extracting with this non-negative matrix factorization the common spatial synergy, we observe that in most subjects, this is one subject, we observe this kind of relationship. Group of muscles are activated with a particular balance. What is interesting is now that if you see the recorded EMGs time over different muscles, we can reconstruct then with the red lines the precise temporal course for different movement directions. Here are 8 movement directions around the clock, just with a combination of these 4 different synergies. That is, if we now represent this synergy activation coefficient in a polar plot, direction versus amplitude of the corresponding synergy in that direction, as you can see here, these have a very simple cosine-like tuning curves. This suggests that essentially the coordination of a great number of muscles in order to generate appropriate forces in different directions can be generated with a simple rule, a simple sort of cosine tuning rule and a different synergy combination. This we showed also for reaching movements and movement different velocity. In sum, very briefly, the decomposition of muscle pattern for multidirectional force generation or multidirectional movements shows that a small number of synergies can reconstruct and explains the variety of muscle patterns. And this suggests a very simple strategy that the central nervous system can use to control, that is modulating in amplitude each synergy with a simple rule in order to know exactly how to build a motor command. A second example I want to show you today is showing how the decomposition of muscle pattern can be used to address an older fundamental question about development. When we look, for example, at locomotor patterns, are these really inborn patterns or they require sort of learning in order to be functional and put in place? Now, with Yuri Vanenko and Francesco Lacquaniti in Rome, we recorded EMG patterns from neonates, 2 to 7 days old, and with the wireless EMG system. And what you can see, neonates have a stepping reflex, essentially. Just a plantar surface tactile stimulation induces this stepping and then extension of the leg. And this disappears after a few weeks or months of life to reappear as a full locomotion pattern when they do the first patterns. If we look at the EMGs bilateral, here are different muscles in a couple of neonates, and we compare it with the EMGs of an adult, as shown before, you see that the temporal structure of the neonate EMG is clearly much more simple in a sense. It's kind of an oscillatory sinusoidal activation alternating, of course, the 2 different legs, whereas in the adult you have a much more complex and temporally structured activation. So by looking at the average EMG waveform in neonates, in adults, but also the intermediate stages of development, toddlers and preschoolers, and using the same factorization, decomposition, one can identify temporal synergies, these activation waveform distributed across different muscles through different weights. And we can see what is a sort of a surprising observation is that the neonates have just two components, whereas as soon as the first independent steps are accomplished, there are four components, and these four components remain even if they refine throughout life. Also, if you compare these activation, these locomotion primitives, these temporal synergies in neonates, in rat and humans, with other vertebrates and in the adults, you see that there is still these two only neonates, four in general in different vertebrates, and only the human have a much narrower activation, possibly related to the particular bipedal plantigrade type of locomotion. So in summary, two basic patterns are inborn, are sort of present in the neonates, but they are augmented with two new patterns that develop during the first year of life. And these may be really necessary for the specific of independent locomotion, like applying tangential forces at the contact point. And these patterns are really common to other vertebrates, suggesting that there is a really phylogenetically determined program in the locomotion. Now, the basic approach has been applied in many different preparations, different systems, different behaviors. However, this evidence for muscle synergy is essentially descriptive. We see a variety of patterns, and we can describe them by combination of muscle synergies. We can also, though, try to, and we started this project a few years ago, to reason, can we actually test a prediction of synergies? That is using synergies not just as a descriptive model, but as a causal model. And then one consideration is that if synergies simplify because they constrain the kind of possible muscle activations that can be generated by their combination, there's also another implication that if we now have a perturbation of some sort that cannot be generated, cannot be compensated by the existing synergies, the prediction of such a synergistic model is that it will be much harder to compensate this perturbation or to learn a new pattern that requires new or modified synergies than to compensate a similar perturbation but that can be compensated by recombining existing synergies. So how to test this hypothesis? What we did essentially is to use virtual reality and magnetic control to create simulate a complex tendon transfer surgery. Imagine simply here illustrated again in a cartoon that you have an arm with four muscles, two pairs of agonist and antagonist muscles. And each one, of course, has a force at the end. And you can imagine that there is a synergy between these two muscles, one and two flexors, so that they combine action, combine forces in this direction. Now imagine that you do a tendon transfer surgery so that these two muscles now, they act on the same joint, so they cancel each other. Now, if there is a neural synergy organized that activates these muscles, it's going to be ineffective to generate force. And in order to generate force in this direction, you have to learn to change the coordination of those muscles, to create a new synergy. So we didn't do any surgery, of course, on the subject, but we used our virtual reality setup and so isometric force generation to essentially characterize the linear mapping from EMG recorded in different muscles and forces, and then to alter this mapping. So we first have a subject just producing forces, so in force control, and we can estimate with the linear mapping the force associated to each muscle. Then we use non-negative matrix factorization to identify muscle synergies. And then by the combination of these two transformations, each synergy has a particular force in the plane of forces that are generated. Then we can alter, because we can use a magnetic control to simulate the force, so move the cursor, not anymore with the actual force recorded, but with the EMG recorded map and through an estimated force. And we can rearrange, so move the direction of force that each muscle applies in the simulation. So here you see a rotation of the muscle patterns, and this corresponds to a rotation of the hypothetical synergies. If the synergies are generating the force, of course they're going to be generating force in different directions, but all direction can be generated. So we call this a compatible virtual surgery, because even after this perturbation, by recombining synergies, you can generate any force direction. We can compare this with an incompatible surgery, where now there is still a rotation. In fact, these two rotations are calibrated to be similar in amount of change in individual muscles, but now you can see you can realign the muscles, the forces associated with the synergy. If this is the case, now if the nervous system is using synergy, in this condition, will be unable to generate force in all directions. If it's using individual muscles, in any case, there's not going to be a difference in the control. So we run an experiment, we compare myoelectric control, both with a compatible and incompatible surgery, and what we see is essentially that subjects are very good to perform the task in baseline, so myoelectric control works well, they can reach 8 different targets in force. And then when we introduce the surgery, there are large errors, distortion, but then after 200 trials approximately, in the compatible case they learn, in the incompatible they don't. There are some targets are never able to reach. And when they remove, we have in the compatible case the opposite, the after effect. So meaning they have learned a new sort of way of compensating the perturbation and they apply the opposite. If we quantify, for example, for the initial direction error, the angle between the target and the actual movement direction, you see on the subject individual trials, the decrease in the compatible case, they remain high. If we look at across blocks, you see the difference in across subject. There is a significant difference, not at the beginning, the perturbations are equally difficult, but as the experiment progresses, is much larger the error at the end for incompatible than compatible surgeries. Then, this means essentially that it's much harder. This confirms the prediction if the central nervous system actually organizes muscle synergies, it's going to be harder to overcome an incompatible and incompatible surgery. And this is sort of a more stronger, more direct support to the hypothesis that muscle synergies are not just a description, but they are organized by the nervous system. Now, we can also, in this more recent work, look at what happens if we actually have more time to practice. When we learn a new skill, typically we need extended practice. So to move towards that direction, we started doing the same experiment, repeating it for 3 different days on 3 different sessions. So subjects, they perform, they learn either compatible and incompatible, and then there is a washout and they recover. You can see here again, incompatible, that also in the incompatible perturbation, this is the last movement of the first day, or the second day, and the third day. Also here, with respect to the single day, there is a much stronger performance improvement. Indeed, if we quantify the average, sort of in this case, a number of successful trials for the compatible and incompatible, in the first day, we don't see much improvement. This is essentially the same behavior we saw in the original study I presented before in terms of now percentage of successful trials. But you see across days there is an improvement. And of course for the compatible, after washout, there is a sort of the return to the beginning to sort of almost the same performance. They have to relearn, but they do it faster. But for the incompatible, there is a progressive learning. Now, what is more interesting, I want to just give a brief hint, this is the ongoing work, is that if you look at these incompatible cases and look at the averages essentially across subjects, and now you look at the individual behavior, individual subject, the performance of individual subject in the incompatible, you see that some subjects actually do not learn at all. And some subjects seems to learn much better. In fact, we can group them with some sort of Bayesian statistics according to learners and non-learners, and only half of the subjects actually learn. So this indicates that in this task where really learning a new synergy is a prototype of learning a new motor skills, there are large inter-individual differences in learning capacity. And I think this approach has a potential to give new tools to investigate these inter-individual differences. Really, I want to summarize this point, the fact that we don't see any performance improvement in a single session with incompatible, whereas we see with compatible, shows that there are really in place 2 different learning mechanisms. A fast learning mechanism that involves recombining synergies, and a slow learning mechanism that allows to learn new coordination pattern and potentially learn new skills. And the fact there are large inter-individual differences into the performance when you have the same kind of perturbation shows that there are different learning abilities, and it's something to be investigated. Now I want to simply conclude by looking and discussing how these new approaches can be used for neurorehabilitation. In particular, there are 2 potential uses. One is really diagnostic. Essentially, muscle synergies may, both their structure, how it's changed after a neurological lesion, and how they are recruited, these changes, may provide a quantitative indicator, a biomarker of the functional impairment. And this could be used to assess, for example, the efficacy of a rehabilitation treatment. But more than that, we can sort of try to use information about what are the specific and individualized changes in the synergistic organization to drive feedback which target the specific recovery for that sort of personalized subject. Just a couple of examples of recent results looking at changes in muscle synergies after neurological lesion. After stroke in the upper limb, Vincent Chung and collaborators recently shown that if you look now, you compare the muscle synergy extracted in the unaffected arm and in the affected arm after an hyparetic subject, after a stroke, a cortical stroke, you see that depending on the level of impairment, essentially you can have some of the synergies that are preserved as similar, but in some cases the synergy can be merged, meaning that in the affected side you see synergy that appear to be a combination, a merging of healthy side synergies. And this has a correlation with the severity of the impairment, essentially with the Fugl-Meyer score. But also, in other cases, you see that impaired, affected side, the synergies are a fractionation of the healthy side synergies. And this is correlated with the duration, post-stroke duration. So it may be associated with compensatory mechanism that produce sort of compensatory synergies. In my lab, we recently looked at a cerebellar patient with cerebellar atrophy. And again, we recorded muscle patterns in simple reaching movements in different directions in the vertical planes. You see an example of a healthy subject and a cerebellar ataxic patient. You see a lot of differences in the individual muscle pattern. This is just average across repetition. You have longer burst duration, activity in multiple directions, multiple bursts, delayed activation. Again, it's a complex changes, but we can characterize these by extracting, in this case, different types of muscle synergies in the healthy subjects and try to reconstruct the patterns of each of the healthy subject and cerebellar ataxic patient. And the remarkable observation we had is that there is no change in the spatial synergies. Spatial synergies are preserved, are the same in both cases. There is a significant difference in temporal, even larger change in the spatiotemporal synergy, which I haven't given you details how they're organized, but essentially represent coordination in space and time. And moreover, there is a significant correlation between clinical score, ICAR score, and the quality of the reconstruction of the healthy synergies in the cerebellar data. So again, there is a sensitive marker of impairment using muscle synergies. So finally, can we use these for rehabilitation? One popular approach is that of using robotic devices to aid rehabilitation, allowing to having task-oriented intensive practice. You know, there are a lot of commercial systems providing assistance to post-stroke patients. The problem is that these approaches are essentially based on providing kinematic template. If the subject doesn't move, the robot will move the subject. This doesn't necessarily enhance or improve or sort of induces active participation. If the subject is passive, is lacking, there is actually assistance to provide. Whereas if we think about using the EMG signals of myoelectric control and the notion of muscle synergy, we could design a much more personalized system. We can record EMG signals and then use the difference essentially between some target muscle synergies to drive assistive forces, maybe within an exoskeleton, only as much as the subject is trying actively to generate muscle patterns that are close to some reference synergies, and these will sort of reinforce plasticity that is actually in the direction of producing physiological muscle patterns. Oops. In summary, conclusion, what I show you today essentially is that muscle synergies may be a strategy that the nervous system organizes to simplify the control by reducing the dimensionality of the problem and allowing a simple or a simpler mapping between task goals and motor commands. And this hypothesis has been supported by a number of studies in which have shown that a small number of synergies can reconstruct the muscle pattern across a variety of conditions. But also, in my opinion, a more direct tests come by testing a prediction of a muscle synergy model that whatever is incompatible with the synergies will be harder to learn or harder to adapt to. And finally, muscle synergies can lead to new approaches in neurorehabilitation, both diagnostic and therapeutics. And I'd like to conclude acknowledging many collaborators, Fondazione Santa Lucia in Rome, but also since a few years, University of Messina, where I have another lab. And for the virtual surgery work, this is collaboration with a group in Canada of Dinesh Pai, funded by Human Frontier Project. Thank you very much.